Hello, welcome to EPG Pashala Spanish. My name is Nabil Ansari and I teach Spanish in the Center of Spanish, Portuguese, Italian and Latin American Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. We are in the paper entitled Spanish Grammar 1. In this module entitled Verbos con o sin las preposiciones, you are going to learn about the verbs which do not take any preposition and the verbs which are always followed by the prepositions, and also about the verbs which take different prepositions at different times, leading to a change in their meaning. Many Spanish verbs take a prepositional complement. The preposition is attached to the verb and is not lost when the verb is followed by an infinitive. For example, Me alegro de ver a mi amigo, meaning I'm glad to see my friend. Thus, for this reason, it is very important to know if a verb has a prepositional complement that cannot be separated. It makes no sense to make a list of verbs that have no prepositional complement, as the majority of the verbs do not take prepositions, but of those which are always attached to a preposition. But let's start with those Spanish verbs which need no preposition before an infinitive, or it is not obligatory to place a preposition after these verbs. For example, Rahul come frutas, or Nuria habla francés. Thus, generally no preposition is placed after verbs if the verb is followed by a noun. For example, cambiar el sofá or empezar el trabajo. But there are also use of the verb cambiar whereby the preposition is added to the verb. For example, cambiarse de casa. Now let's see the examples of cambiar el sofá and cambiarse de casa. So, if I say cambio el sofá de lugar, means I'm putting the sofa somewhere else or moving the sofa. But if I say me cambio de casa, it means I am moving the house. Same way, empezar el trabajo, but empezar a trabajar. So in the first sentence, the verb empezar is followed by a noun, so there was no preposition. But in the second sentence, when the verb empezar is followed by another verb, there is a preposition a. So the example, pronto empiezo el trabajo, meaning soon I start the work. Or empiezo a trabajar pronto, which means soon I start to work. So the first one was I start the work. Sentence it is I start to work. Thus there are other verbs that do not require any preposition. So the first verb in this list is aconsejar, which means to advise. Now we are also provide you the examples of all these verbs so that you can understand them better. So the example of aconsejar is Mi madre siempre me aconseja que hay que ayudar a la gente, meaning my mother always advised me that one has to help the people. Celebrar. Celebrar means to celebrate. Example, hoy Juan celebra su cumpleaños, meaning today Juan celebrates his birthday. Necesitar, which means to need. So if someone asks, perdone, necesito unas tijeras, ¿las tienes? That means, excuse me, I need scissors. Do you have it? Escuchar, means to listen. For example, escucho la radio por la noche, meaning I listen to the radio at night. Preferir means to prefer. Thus, if I say yo prefiero descansar los fines de semana, it means I prefer to rest on weekends. Recordar. Recordar means to remember. For example, ¿recuerdas que hoy tienes que depositar el cheque? Meaning, you remember that today you have to deposit the check. Pretender means to claim. Example, ella pretende que es muy rica, aunque no lo es. Meaning, she claims to be rich, but she is not. Buscar means to look for. Example, estoy buscando un trabajo. Meaning, I'm looking for a job. Pedir. Pedir is to ask. Example, por favor, pide la cuenta, which means please ask for the bill. So, the verbs or some of the verbs which do not require any preposition normally is are aconsejar, celebrar, necesitar, escuchar, preferir, recordar, pretender, buscar y pedir. And not only these, there are most of the verbs do not require any preposition normally. There are verbs that do not require preposition if followed by a noun or object. Or there are some verbs that require a preposition in English, but in Spanish they go without a preposition. For example, acordar means to agree on something. For example, acuerdo los términos del contrato, meaning I agree the terms of the contract, or I agree on the terms of the contract. Mirar, which means to look at. For example, miro la revista. I am looking at the magazine. Pedir. Pedir is to ask for. For example, ella pide permiso para salir, which means she is asking for permission to leave. Esperar. Esperar means to wait for. For example, espero el tren, meaning I am waiting for the train. Now, there are verbs with no prepositions when followed by another verb, and some of them are desear, which means to wish or desire. For example, deseo verte pronto, which means I wish to see you soon. Esperar, which means to wait or to hope to. For example, espero llegar a tiempo, which means I hope to reach on time. Evitar, which means to avoid. For example, evita entrar en discusiones con él, which means avoid getting into arguments with him. Fingir, which means to pretend to. For example, ella finge saber la noticia, which means she pretends to know the news. Hacer, a very common verb which means to make. For example, siempre me haces esperar, meaning you always keep me waiting. Impedir, which means to prevent from. Impedir, which means to prevent from. El dolor le impide caminar, meaning the pain prevents her from walking. Intentar, which means to try to. Ella intenta convencerlo, meaning she is trying to convince him. Jurar, which means to swear to. Example, él jura vengarse de ella, which means he swore to get his revenge on her. Mandar, which means to order to. Te mando callar, which means I'm ordering you to keep quiet. Merecer, which means to deserve to. For example, mereces ganar, which means you deserve to win. Saber, as you know, which means to know how to or to know. For example, mi hermano sabe nadar, which means my brother knows how to swim. Soler, which means to be used to or usually. For example, ella suele venir por aquí una vez a la semana, which means she usually comes by once a week. Temer, which means to be afraid to. For example, temo ofenderlo, which means I'm afraid of offending him. Ordenar, which means to order to. For example, te ordeno salir inmediatamente de la oficina, which means I order you to leave immediately from the office. Parecer, which means to seem to. Example, el problema parece no tener solución, meaning there seems to be no solution to the problem. Pensar, meaning to think or intend to. For example, ¿piensas ir? Means, are you thinking of going? Permitir, which means to allow to. For example, su título le permite ejercer la profesión, meaning his qualification allows her to practice the profession. Poder, meaning can or to be able to. For example, no puedo pagar tanto, meaning I can't pay that much. Same way, preferir. Preferir means to prefer to. For example, prefiero jugar, meaning I prefer to play. Pretender means to try to. For example, ¿qué pretendes decir con eso? Meaning, what are you trying to say? And last one is procurar, which means to really try to. For example, procura no olvidarte, meaning try not to forget. Now these were some verbs with no preposition when followed by another verb. And I repeat, some of the verbs that we have seen in the list are desear, esperar, evitar, fingir, hacer, impedir, intentar, jurar, mandar, merecer, saber, soler, temer, ordenar, parecer, pensar, permitir, poder, preferir, pretender y procurar. Now we are going to see the verbs with prepositions. So there are verbs which compulsorily take a preposition and they are not used without their corresponding prepositions. Now some of the verbs which always take prepositions in a context are casarse con alguien, enfadarse de alguien o gozar de algo, ir a o ir de un lugar, quedar con alguien, sospechar de o olvidarse de o tratar de hacer algo. So in these with these verbs, as you can see, the prepositions like con, de, a are used. Now let's learn about these verbs in detail, and we start with the verbs with preposition a. And there are many verbs which takes the preposition a, and there are few verbs which also takes other preposition, but as I mentioned in the beginning, the meaning of these verbs will change as according to the preposition which it takes. So first we will see the verbs with preposition a, and the first one that we have in the list is aprender a, meaning to learn to. For example, aprendo a leer en español, which means I'm learning to read in Spanish. Same way, another verb is aspirar, which means to aspire to. So aspirar also takes the preposition a. For example, mi amigo aspira a ser ingeniero, which means my friend aspires to be an engineer. Same way, another verb is atreverse a, meaning to dare to or to be so bold as to. For example, ¿Cómo te atreves a contestar así a tu madre? Meaning, how dare you talk back to your mother like that? Ayudar a, which means to help to. For example, ayúdame a poner la mesa, meaning help me to put the table. Comenzar a, meaning to begin to or to start to. For example, él comienza a disparar, meaning he begins firing. Contribuir a, meaning to contribute to. For example, su silencio solo contribuye a empeorar la situación, which means your silence only makes the situation worse. Dedicarse a, which means to dedicate oneself to or to devote oneself to. For example, ¿a qué se dedica su padre? Meaning what your father does. Enseñar a. Enseñar a, which means to teach how to. For example, me enseña a nadar, meaning he is teaching me how to swim. Invitar a alguien, which means to invite to someone. For example, te invito a cenar. So invitar a, which means to invite to. For example, te invito a cenar, which means I'm inviting you for dinner. Ir a, which means to go to or to be going to. For example, voy a la universidad, meaning I'm going to the university. Llegar a. Llegar a means to arrive or to reach. For example, llegamos a casa a las 2, which means we reach home at 2 o'clock. Salir, which means to go out to or to come out to, also takes the preposition a. For example, sales a jugar, meaning are you coming out or are you going out to play? And volver a, which means to do something again or to return to. For example, vuelvo a ver esta película, meaning I am watching this movie again. So these were some verbs which takes the preposition a, and apart from these verbs there are also other verbs which takes the preposition a, and some of them are acercarse a, which means to approach, acertar a, which means to manage to, acostumbrarse a, which means to be or get used to, alcanzar a, which means to manage to, animar a, which means to encourage to, impulsar a, which means to urge to, incitar a, which means to incite to, inclinar a, which means to incline to. Llegar a ser, which means to become. Llevar a, which means to lead to. Mandar a, which means to send to. And there are more verbs which you can learn from the e-text, the verbs that takes the preposition a. Now let's learn some verbs followed by the preposition de. So there are some verbs which takes the preposition de. For example, acabar de, which means to have just. For example, acabo de llegar, which means I have just reached. Acordarse de, meaning to remember. For example, no te acuerdas de Elena, which means don't you remember Elena. Alegrarse de, which means to be happy to or to be pleased to. For example, me alegro de verte aquí, meaning I am pleased to see you here. Cansarse de, which means to tire of or to grow tired of. For example, me canso de estudiar tanto, which means I'm tired of studying so much. Dejar de, which means to stop doing something. For example, dejo de fumar pronto, which means I will stop smoking soon. Depender de, which means to depend on. For example, ellos dependen económicamente de sus padres, meaning they depend on their parents financially. Olvidarse de, which means to forget. For example, nunca me olvido de su aniversario de boda, meaning I never forget their wedding anniversary. Quejarse de, which means to complain about. For example, se queja de que le duele el pecho, meaning she is complaining of chest pain. Terminar de, which means to finish or to stop doing something. For example, déjame terminar de hablar, meaning let me finish speaking. Tratar de, which means to try to. For example, trato de comprenderlo, which means I'm trying to understand it. And apart from these verbs, there are also other verbs which takes the preposition de, and some of them are arrepentirse de, which means to regret. Avergonzarse de, which means to be ashamed of. Cansarse de, which means to tire or get tired of. Cuidar de, which means to take care or be careful to. Jactarse de, which means to boast about. Lamentarse de, which means to bemoan. Preocuparse de, which means to be concerned about. Presumir de, which means to boast about. So these were some prepositions which these were some verbs which take the preposition de. Now we are going to see the verbs followed by the preposition en. For example, consistir en, which means to consist of. Example, el mobiliario consiste en una cama y unos estantes para libros, which means the furniture consists of a bed and some bookshelves. Convenir en, which means to agree to. For example, hemos convenido en la fecha, meaning we have agreed on a date. Insistir en, which means to insist on. For example, insiste en que es tuyo, which means she insists that it's hers. Pensar en, which means to think about. For example, pienso en ti siempre, meaning I think about you always. Apart from these verbs, there are also other verbs which takes the preposition en, and some of them are confiar en, which means to trust to, dudar en, which means to hesitate to, persistir en, which means to persist in, quedar en, which means to agree on, and tardar en, which means to take a long time to or delay in. There are also verbs followed by the preposition con. For example, amenazar con, which means to threaten with or to threaten to. Example, los mineros amenazan con una nueva huelga, meaning the miners are threatening a further strike. Contar con, which means to count on or to rely on. For example, puedo contar con tu colaboración. Can I count on your help? Another verb is basta, so bastar, so bastar con, meaning enough with something. For example, basta con esto, meaning will this be enough? Casarse con, which means to get married. For example, me caso con mi novia, meaning I am marrying my girlfriend. Now, apart from these verbs, there are also other verbs which takes the preposition con, and some of them are amenazar con, meaning to threaten to, comenzar con, meaning to begin with, soñar con, meaning to dream of, tener que ver con, meaning to concern or to have to do. And also there are verbs followed by the preposition por. For example, acabar por, which means to end up by doing something. A sentence with the verb acabar por is acaban por aceptarlo, meaning they will end up accepting it. Optar por, which means to opt for something. For example, opto por el premio en metálico, meaning I opt for cash prize. Esforzarse por, which means to make efforts for something or to strive for. For example, se está esforzando por mejorarlo, meaning he is making efforts to improve it. Luchar por, which means to fight for something or someone. For example, ellos luchan por la paz, meaning they are fighting for peace. And estar por, which means to be in favor of. For example, estoy por trabajar los lunes, which means I am in favor of working on Mondays. And apart from these verbs, there are also other verbs which takes the preposition por, and some of them are apurarse por, which means to strive to, comenzar por, which means to begin with or to begin by, and disculparse por, which means to apologize for. So as you can see that the verbs that you have learned in the previous modules, when they take a preposition, their meaning changes. And one example that can be is estar por, as you must have learned that estar means to be, but estar, when it is followed by the preposition por, it means to be in favor of something or someone. And there are also certain expressions that are not followed by any prepositions but only by a verb in the infinitive form. And very quickly, let's see these expressions, and in great detail you see in the e-text. And some of the expressions are es difícil, es fácil, es importante, es posible o es imposible, es necesario o es innecesario, es inútil, es mejor, es menester, es peligroso, and y es preciso. Now these are some expressions that are not followed by any expressions but only by a verb in the infinitive form. Thus, in this module, you have learned about the verbs which do not take any preposition, and also the verbs which are always followed by the preposition, and also about the verbs which take different prepositions at different times, leading to a change in their meaning. If you want to learn more about these verbs which take prepositions, and also if you want to learn more about this topic, you should refer back to the e-text, which also has some exercises to check whether you have understood them or not, and also to help you to understand them in a better way. Thank you.